Welcome everybody to our latest transition webinar designed to help secure a sustainable future for your farm business. I'm your host, Johan Tasker. When we talk about a sustainable future here at Farmers Weekly, we mean a future that is sustainable financially, not just environmentally. And that means profitable farming. And when it comes to improving farm income, is it best to diversify and do something completely different? Or is it best to specialise and add value to one of your existing farm enterprises? Both have pitfalls and can generate valuable revenue, but it's also important to avoid the potential pitfalls. And we've brought together 4 experts to explain the pros and cons of these approaches that we're going to cover include business planning considerations, the balance between the level of input and reward, environmental impact, and different types of diversification. To help us do that, let me introduce our panel of experts. Hamish Wardrop is an agronomist and chartered surveyor and national rural consultancy manager for Agravista. Greg Ricketts is a director and head of farm business for GSC Grays in the north of England, specialising in farm business consultancy. Johnny Wake is managing partner of Courtenhall Farms, a 750-hectare diversified rural business on the south side of Northampton. And James Small is a third-generation livestock farmer and partner in a mixed and diversified family farming business on the Mendip Hills in Somerset. I'm going to ask James and Johnny in a minute to just describe their farm businesses. But if any of you have any questions, do please use the chat box facility to ask them. We'll try and get through as many questions as we can in the time that we have together, about an hour and a quarter. And do feel free to contribute to the discussion. James, I'm going to start with you. Could you briefly describe your farm business and the diversifications that you're involved with, please?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Johan, and hello, everyone. So I'm a third-generation farmer at our actual current farm, which is Warren Farm. We're just located on top of Cheddar Gorge on the Mendip Hills in Somerset. During the time my family's been here, we've done lots of different things. So when my grandfather came here, we were doing everything. We had milking cows, beef cows, pigs, chickens, sheep, a bit of arable root crops. But it kind of got streamlined over the decades. We went fairly well arable in the 70s, early 80s, and then transferred over to livestock farming after that, which is what we're currently with now. We have about 550 acres under ownership at the moment, or at least we pay a mortgage on it, and around another 700 acres, which we have on various agreements. So a little bit's on an AHA tenancy, some is on FBTs, and the majority would be on annual grazing licenses with landlords. It will be triple SI land, very steep, mostly land that are in nature reserves. And we operate a novel grazing system where we're actually paid to graze those areas on behalf of the landlords. Creates a bit of a challenge with livestock for us because of management and movement, but it's something that works at the moment. Since the change in the regimes from the CAP to the ELMS, we've dropped a little bit in numbers in terms of animals that we carry. So our sheep flock at the moment is 1,500 breeding ewes. We've dropped from 120 single suckler cows down to 80 now. And they're certainly a lot tighter at the moment. We're looking at those quite sharply. And trying to improve what we do. We're moving to where we were housing the cattle over winter. We're now going to outwintering as much as possible, preloading fields with hay bales, putting them behind electric fences, basically trying to extend the grazing or the time that they're out anyway. The type of cattle we have are very well suited to that, and we've been breeding towards that. So it's a longer term aim, but as we all know, it takes a long time to get there. Over the years, well, the last 15 years, we've gone into some different diversifications as well. So a little bit of rentals, but we also moved into glamping. The location that we have lends itself. Our USP is the Cheddar Gorge. So that's, people have either been there as children and coming back bringing their families, or it's something famous enough for foreign visitors to want to come and see. So we currently have 5 canvas lodges, we call them. They're like tents, but they sleep 5 adults, 6 people total. Hardwood floors, log burners, running water, flushing toilets, and they're self-catered. We then have 2 larger log cabins, which can sleep 8 adults over 4 bedrooms, and then 2 two-person pods as well, so more for couples or grandparents coming to stay with the families, or however it works out in those mixes. We also have a dog exercising paddock on the farm as well, so people can book up slots to come and exercise their pooches, which works quite well. We have had a lot of problems with dog worrying in the past, certainly given our sheep some problems. And so we thought it was worthwhile to try and create an area where people, if they do have problem dogs, can come and safely use the area, safely let their dogs off of a lead, maybe aid with training or whatever. So thought we couldn't really complain about it unless we gave people an option. So we moved into doing that. That about covers us, I think, for what we're doing. Farming wise, we're a little bit of arable in terms for forage, but principally we're grass. We're into the SFI. We got a classic ELS HLS agreement, and we've just entered into the SFI 23 scheme for herbal rich lays and some of the record keeping stuff. So the SAM 1, SAM 2, SAM 3 on as much land as we can for it. We look at whatever grants we can do as well for fencing, water pipes, splitting fields down, hedge plant. And so in the last 2 years, we've planted nearly 7,000 trees on the farm. And we'll be looking at doing a bit more of that over the coming years as well, as and when we can apply for the funding or it becomes available. I think that's about me.
Thank you, James. Johnny, introduce yourself and your business and your diversifications, if you would, please.
Thanks, Johan. So as you said, we're on the sort of southern border of Northampton, South Northants, heavy clay, hand soaked clay series. We have traditionally been arable farmers with a bit of residential property, which kind of has got us out of jail when farming's been tough. And we have tried to diversify since then. So from a farming point of view, we have gone into stewardship in a big way. We've always been into a bit of stewardship, but we're now 2.5 years into a large 10-year higher tier agreement with Natural England, which has opened up an awful lot of possibilities to us. And we're doing SFI as well, just like James. We've also become broiler chicken farmers. So we have 8 sheds, 340,000 birds, and 3 guys on the team who are full-time dedicated towards that. So that's been a big diversification for us. Obviously gives us muck from the poultry to go on the fields, and we can grow wheat to grow into the birds as well. And we've gone back into beef farming as well. My great-grandpa, through to my grandpa, had traditional Herefords, and we've gone back to having traditional Herefords now. We know they're not going to make us a fortune, to put it mildly, but they give us control back over the grazing and enable us to improve the soils. Those cattle are out all winter, and they get no supplementary feed, so they're just left to nature, and very low input, very low cost. So that's on the agricultural side. Our blessing and our curse is our location on that southern edge of Northampton. But the good side of it is commercial property is really hot around us. So we try and play to our strengths and convert as many farm barns as we can. And the joy of planning permission, which is something we may come on to later in the debate. And we're big on renewable energy. I could bore you all senseless about heat pumps, which we've gone into in a big way. And like a lot of people, we've got a lot of rooftop solar panels as well. We do weddings and events, and we also have a big program with local schools.
Thank you very much, Johnny. Thanks, James. I'm going to move on to Greg and Hamish. Greg, starting with you. More farmers do seem to be diversifying the need to generate additional farm income. What sort of inquiries are you seeing from your clients?
Thanks, Johan. Yeah, I think very typically we see quite a lot of diversification opportunities around tourism and holiday accommodation, provision of services to people coming to visit the area, very typically with 3 national parks in our locality. That is quite a key theme amongst a lot of clients. Having said that, probably from the perspective of, in terms of financial returns, some of those areas of diversification have possibly just got a little bit overdone. Quite a lot of glamping resources, holiday lets, camping sites, and so we still see inquiries for that, but we're probably not seeing too many people pursue it just at the moment. In addition to that, we've got clients who are looking at provision of contracting services, but not necessarily your traditional farm contracting, but to building firms and to other utility companies and those kind of things as well. So a little bit more niche, got the skills, the expertise that allows them to diversify and offer those services, but very much targeting a market outside of agriculture. We've got all of the things that both James and Johnny talked about: renewables, solar, wind, those kind of things as well. Commercial property, lots of movement into environmental schemes, and some processing of farm products as well. So quite a mix of things, I think, really. And that's probably not an exhaustive list either.
Thank you. And Hamish, how about yourself?
Yeah, it's an interesting point Greg brought up. It was about, I mean, we see a lot less in terms of tourism because I'm down in Hampshire, which is not the as beautiful as it is. We're not in a prime tourist location. It's not to say it can't work. I've got one farm where they use some holiday lets. It's located close to an RAF base, and actually sort of parents visiting sort of young service men and women sort of generates a demand. But the lion's share in this area of diversification, we see a lot of inquiries for converting to light industrial business type use, and that's just a factor of the geography we are. But all sorts of things from on-farm processing, creating space for butchery on farm, but sort of more and more sort of with my agronomy hat on, sort of we're getting asked to go and look after blocks of pumpkins or sunflowers where and they can turn out to be very seasonal, but they can be sort of, if the demand's there, they can be really quite lucrative diversifications.
Thank you. I'm going to move back to James and Johnny, and then we'll sort of start fielding some questions. I mean, you're both in different ways taking advantage or making the most, capitalising on the location and what's around you. James, how did you decide to go into glamping? What sort of swayed you? Talk me through the sort of the decision process there.
Well, it was actually, so 2009, I suppose, 2010. So my wife and I were recently married, had our first child and second on the way, and she was a school teacher, and we quickly realised that grand plans about becoming parents and looking after children and childcare, and it was all these great plans suddenly weren't going to work. And so we thought about whether there was something we could do on farm that would replace her wage. The farming business that we had at that time ticked along and did what it did, but it wasn't going to bring in that extra. So we looked at something that we might be able to do on the farm to make use of it. And we actually looked at pitch tent camping. That was our initial thought, to run a seasonal part with that. And during our research, we came across this company that we've gone in with, who offered a service whereby they provided the equipment, we provided the facility. So there was a cost to set up, but not a huge cost. And they deal with the marketing, finance side of it. So in a way, they supply you the customers, which seemed to be a fairly good way in. So we dipped our toe in and put 7 accommodation units in. Planning, as Johnny said, it was interesting. I mean, I don't think I've yet to meet someone who said planning was an absolute joy. The planners were helpful. Everyone was brilliant. So it was a challenge. We were in AONB then. We're a protected landscape now, national protected landscape. But we got it. And we put it in, and then we started operating that way. And then over the years, we learned a bit more. We've expanded a bit, and we've sort of grown it. But our initial point was thinking, actually, we wanted to try and do something on the farm that would enable my wife to stop working where she was in the hours she was doing, but still be working, but be able to be working here. And as with a lot of diversifications, the thing that we thought would be the sideline diversification has become probably the single biggest sector earner into the farm at the moment.
Thank you. So it's a fairly, in terms of cost, there was a fairly low entry point there. It didn't require a great amount of investment, as some diversifications can involve lots of money, and also you had some sort of help, a little bit of holding with the marketing side of things.
Absolutely. I mean, it was enough of an investment for what we're used to doing, but nowhere near what it would have been if we were starting completely on our own. And you're going into a completely new sector. I mean, I agree with what Greg touched on a little earlier. I think in the glamping market now, there's probably a bit of saturation. There's a lot of people doing it. There's a lot of choice. The market's only so big. We have invested in. I wouldn't be investing any more into it at the moment. I think we're focusing on trying to get bums on seats effectively now. But you do have to work hard at it, and we've learned a lot over the last 14 years or so, 13 years about that. And yes, you can have a brilliant location, but it really does come down to the person's mindset. You as the farmer person operating it. If you're not putting your heart and soul into it, it's not going to happen. There's a lot more to it than just the financial investment.
And we'll come on to discussing some of those challenges and changes in mindset, I guess, that lots of different diversifications require. So different diversifications that attract different people, and not all diversifications are for everybody. Johnny, what about yourself? How did you decide to do what you're doing?
Oh, I'd love to say there was a really well thought out, planned process, but it was more just sort of firing bullets into the air and hoping something came down. When it came to the poultry, James made the point about capital outlay. Well, that was the opposite to him. We took out 2 very scarily big bank loans to do that. And we took a big gamble. And I think the key thing for me getting into poultry, as someone who knew nothing about poultry, and many would argue still knows nothing about poultry compared to what he should, I found someone who was there to act as a mentor and advisor to me. And he was incredibly kind with his time. And without him, I probably wouldn't have had the confidence to do it. Because we are running it ourselves, and this is not some kind of rental operation or even a JV. So that was really key with the poultry. With the beef, obviously, very different story. It's a much less commercial enterprise, a completely different end of the scale in terms of intensity. And the key thing for that actually again came down to people. We had a guy on our team who had a really great background in livestock and a passion for it. I suppose if we're talking about diversification, you can do it purely for the money, or you can do it purely for the passion. But ideally, you want that Venn diagram to overlap, don't you? And it needs to be something that you care about and you can do really well.
Thank you. And things like you say you're involved with weddings as well. I mean, that's. I mean, James, holidays are important for people, but weddings are even more important, Johnny. That's a sort of a high pressure diversification to go into.
Yeah, and so a lot of the diversifications we're talking about are dealing with the general public, aren't they? And I think everyone needs to be aware of the challenges that come with that, the demands that come with that, the rewards that come with it too. But yeah, weddings are really hard because inevitably people want the very best for it, and it's really, really tough. And we've ended up going more and more into commercial events and drifting away from weddings because it is easier for us, but you don't always get to choose your market.
Sure. Right. Thank you very much. And Hamish, I'm going to go to you and then to Greg. If I'm a farmer thinking of diversifying into doing something that perhaps I've no experience of doing before, it might be glamping, it might be a wedding venue, commercial events, it might be a completely different farming enterprise such as poultry. Where should I start? What should I be looking at?
Well, I mean, I think with diversification, I think the point both James and Johnny have made is that they're hungry on time. They're hungry. You've got to have access to the right staff to do it. And I think you've got to make sure that you do it in such a way that it doesn't that time doesn't start eating into your farming business. If you're missing pre-emergent sprays or sort of harvesting windows, whatever it may be, because you're focusing on your diversification, you can soon create a big problem, because obviously the main farming enterprise is so time critical, and sort of the ramifications of being a week late for something sort of come back to bite you. But you've got to establish there's a market. We touched on that, and then you've got to establish whether or not it's possible. In terms of, does the premises lend itself to the use? Is planning permission required? What the actual, are there any sort of, and how it's going to be paid for. So it's all of those we've touched on, but you've got to have a great idea, and it does, because it's a new business fundamentally, isn't it? And it's got to attract members of the public. But then there's, behind that, there's planning, financing, staffing, all to consider.
Thank you, Greg. Where would you start if somebody comes to you and says, I want to diversify, or I'm thinking of adding value to an existing enterprise? Where do you start?
Yeah, well, I think I'd agree with everything Hamish said. All of those things apply. I think fundamentally, probably, what are the objectives? What are you trying to achieve in terms of business profitability? Where is the business now? How strong is it in terms of profits generated, its capital position, your ability to borrow money if that's required? So really the fundamentals with the business as it is now, looking at objectives for the future to improve profitability, which is often a key driver for most people if they're embarking on any kind of diversification, much as exactly as James said almost at the outset. And then you've got to look at the skills, resources that you've got available. A farm is, in most people's eyes, it's obviously a farm, but it's a collection of resources. It's got land, there's buildings, you have people, machines. How are you going to use those to best effect to achieve whatever your objectives are? And perhaps the most important thing probably is the idea in terms of what you're going to take forward. So that's the starting point. And then I guess one's getting into the planning process, not just planning from planning consents, but the planning of the business model as it's going to be for the future. So whatever the opportunity is, but starting with the fundamentals in terms of how's it going to work, the practicalities, the physical requirements in terms of resources, staffing, people, management skills, all of those kind of things, marketing fundamentally as well.
Thank you. And how important is it, Greg, to ensure that the farming business itself is on a sure footing before you diversify? I mean, many people probably be thinking, I'm not making enough money, I need to do something else. Is that just the wrong thing to do? Should you look after the farming first before you diversify?
I think it probably depends. There's probably not a right or wrong answer to that. Perhaps a lot of businesses, particularly again in our area, beef and sheep farms, have been very dependent on the basic payment for profitability. And if you look at the actual enterprises themselves, may not be generating enough return and enough cash. But actually, if the rest of the business is quite strong and sound in terms of the capital position, so depending on debt levels and everything else, it's still possible to diversify if your business is perhaps not as profitable as it should be. But you've just got to understand your starting point, I think, and how understand your strengths in terms of the financial part of the business, as well as your strengths in terms of anything else that you've got to offer to bring into the diversification opportunities. So probably a good understanding of the balance sheet that you've got, your assets and liabilities, and that's in an ideal world, strong, effective businesses will own 65% of the assets that they have under their control, and perhaps there's no more than 35% borrowed. So to understand some of those parameters, perhaps from an external perspective, from the accountant, from your consultant, or from your bank, is a good place to start as well. And not to discount this diversification just because perhaps profitability is not as good as it should be. That is the whole point of perhaps trying to find that diversification opportunity.
Thanks, Greg. Johnny, you were saying that there wasn't really a grand plan, so to speak. It was firing bullets into the air and hoping that something came down. But there must have been a little bit more to it than that. I mean, was there? Were you looking to achieve something in particular? Was it about the revenue? Was it about what fitted in with your existing enterprises? How did that work?
So it's a big question, and I took over the farm without a farming background. In my previous job, I was a doctor. I didn't expect to be running the business on a day-to-day point of view. So I felt Like I had a large amount of imposter syndrome when I came in. My family have farmed here for 351 years. And frankly, I didn't want to be the one to screw it up. So I felt a lot of pressure and a lot of focus on surviving rather than actually thriving. And we were in quite a tricky financial place when I took over. So I felt like I couldn't look beyond the end of my nose. And it took me quite a while to think, well, if I'm only thinking about surviving, I'm never actually going to manage to thrive. One of the key things for me doing that was sending myself on the way on a course with the Institute of Agricultural Management's Leadership Development course, and being forced to take that step back. It really is an absolutely wonderful course. Can't recommend it highly enough. And that was probably the start of my journey where I actually got to start being a lot more strategic and tactical about how I was looking at the business. And it also opened up a fantastic network to me. And I always say coming up with the ideas is the easy bit, Johan. It's analyzing those. And in order to analyze those, you can't be an expert in everything. So building up a network of people who, even if they don't have the answer, they know who to talk to find the answer has been so useful and valuable to me. And I've been so lucky as the people I've met. And I'd really urge everyone out there to just really get talking to people, get out there, get meeting people at events like Farmers Weekly Transitions. And it's a really useful thing to do. Does that
Yeah. I mean, but you're saying you didn't really have a farming background, as it were. You're a doctor. It was you didn't want to be the one that screwed it up. I mean, not having that sort of background can be a strength as well as a weakness. You bring in fresh ideas. Probably you're not burdened in the way of doing something from a generational point of view. You've got a bit of a broader experience. Did that help at all, do you think?
Yeah, there's definitely strengths and weaknesses to that. One of the things I think I always say that it brings is I came from the NHS, which for all its flaws is pretty collaborative and cooperative. And I found it surprising how bad we are at cooperating in this country within our industry. And I know it's an often said thing, and I think we're getting much better at it, but we've still got a long way to go. And so I think I come at things from quite a collaborative point of view, which I think and hope is an advantage.
Thank you, James. You're almost, I'm not saying the opposite, but you've got that generational experience. I know Johnny's saying his family's farmed for 350 years or whatever, but you're very much a third generation farmer. Was that a strength or a weakness? Did that enable you to sort of, was it easy to bring in new ideas and a different way of doing things?
It's okay. So there's a mixture of things there, really. I was quite lucky to have my business partners, my family, so uncle, auntie, mother, and father, who were open to suggestions and new ideas. I mean, when we started the glamping business, there was quite a bit of resistance on it because of having the public on the farm and the problems that was going to perceive to be. But we got over that. But I mean, it's interesting listening to Johnny there, just talking about the survive and thrive thing. There is, and I feel it. I find myself recently just feeling sometimes you can get a little bit overwhelmed with things when you're trying to work your way through, and it's really super useful to try and step back out and just go, hang on a minute. If I'm just spending all my time just trying to survive, there's something wrong here. And thankfully my wife was quite helpful with that as well. Just made me pull out for a moment or two just to think about things. 2012 I attended not the same course, but a different course with Worshipful Company of Farmers, which I found to be very useful in terms of strategic leadership thinking, balcony view, as they say a lot. So you're looking at the business overall and just going, hang on, where do we want to take the business? What do we want to do with it? And from that point, I moved from just trying to get by day to move into actually what I want is a sustainable business that turns over enough money to pay us a reasonable wage, and that allows future succession. If my children want to look at taking it on, they can, but they haven't got to farm. But it's a big enough business, or it's profitable enough. Size is irrelevant. It's profitability that matters. If you've got liquidity and cash in the business, you can do things. If you haven't, then you're getting chained to doing it. But I also resonate quite strongly with that, being third generation, fourth generation in farming, of that weight of expectation that you're going to carry on the business and that you're not going to be the one to fail. You've got to try and make it go, which means kind of actually being brave enough to go, right, actually, I hear what you're saying, grandparents, but what you did in your day isn't necessarily what's going to work today. This is the environment we're in now, both physical and business wise, and this is where we've got to take it. And it's been brave enough to take that step.
Thank you. I'm gonna move on to some questions. We've got a number of questions that have come through. I'm not going to say the person's whole name, but I've got a question here from Richard, who is a farmer. I'm already diversifying, but the landlord wants half the income. A statement, I guess, rather than a question. But Hamish, it's different for owner occupiers and tenants. Different situation. And Richard raises a good point. He's already diversifying, but the landlord wants half the income. Can you sort of talk us through the landlord tenant situation briefly?
Yeah, of course. So fundamentally, the first thing to do is go back to the tenancy. That's the framework of the agreement, and you will generally find that if nothing was agreed from the outset, that the use is limited to, or the enjoyment of the premises is for agricultural use only. And sometimes it'll be further, it'll be more specific than that. Particularly, you'll find, sort of dairy only tenancies, and so there's not a sort of presumed right to diversify. However, there are hundreds of examples where landlord and tenant work together, and it can be a great partnership, and both people can do well out of it. So it's not a barrier to entry, but in this case, obviously, ideally, you would approach the landlord and agree what you're going to do before things start. Does the landlord automatically have a right to 50%? No, of course they don't. However, they do have the ability, if you're not allowed to carry out the activity, to sort of remedy that by making you stop or even forfeiting the lease. So, which is an avenue is not good for anyone to go down. So the answer is it needs to be negotiated, and in terms of what's fair, the 50%, you have to sort of lay out on the table exactly what's happening here. How much is the landlord bringing to the table by sort of owning the premises which permit this diversification to take place. But there's as we've talked with James and Johnny, there's a huge amount of labour that goes into these projects, and the sort of the compensation to the landlord needs to be appropriate to what's going on, really. So I think it's as soon as possible clear the air and get a sensible discussion going, because there's the landlord does need to agree. There's factors they need to consider in terms of to make sure that the basis which you're occupying the holding, to make sure they're not sort of inadvertently granting you a commercial lease on at least part of the farm. So it all needs talking through, and sort of done right, everyone can benefit, really.
And before you embark on the diversification, one of the things that I just scrolled down here, Richard says, I'm already diversifying, but the landlord wants half the income generated backdated to 2019. I'm not sure exactly what the situation is there, but that's not something that I'd certainly want to find out 5 years down the line.
I think the message, and sort of my advice in that case would be, you've got to get a sensible dialogue. You've got to look at what's earned, in terms of, and what's been done, and it will unfortunately come down to, well, it will come down to a negotiation. But the really and truly, it needs to be, the diversification can't be stifled. There's, both parties stand to benefit from it, and it's a case of sitting around a table and finding some common ground, I think.
Greg, your experience on that, landlord-tenant relationships?
Yeah, well, I'd agree with Hamish completely. I think a couple of things there. I mean, it does concern me a little bit when he says, Richard says that the landlord wants half the income. Well, I guess the starting point is to get some really good understanding of what the profitability is. I mean, half the income would be a pretty serious implication. The profit levels will not be, and potentially anywhere near that, from lots of diversified enterprises. So understanding what what the profit levels are, but also taking account of those non-cash costs, the family labour that goes into it as well. And I think probably getting a really good case to be put to the landlord when that negotiation happens, I think is pretty fundamental there. And I think on a more positive note, I mean, we do see lots of landlords are quite keen on diversification these days, because why wouldn't they be if it helps generate income that can cover the rent? And it's a good idea. You've got to be, I think, probably quite careful if you're a tenant going into some kind of diversified enterprise that you don't overcommit and then there's no exit strategy and you're left with perhaps the landlord, or losing the tenancy and losing the business. But equally on the other side, we see really strong relationships where people are working together, whether it's on tenancies, joint ventures, those kind of things with diversified enterprises. So I think, again, starting early and starting that discussion, clearly there's a little bit of an issue here with, a need to go back to 2019. So that wants some fairly careful analysis before the discussions start.
Thank you very much. There's another question here, a question from Jake Campbell, who says, how complicated is it to obtain planning permission to convert arable farmland into a campsite? So it's a question obviously made for you, James. How difficult do you find it's embarking on your enterprise?
So it was 2010 when we submitted the planning for here, the planning scheme systems have changed a bit since then. The process, we had to go for change of use of the land, so it went from agricultural to campsite effectively. There were some conditions attached to that. Part of it, we wanted to put up a 60 by 30 agricultural type shed, clear span shed, to provide some facilities on the site. But the planning authority wouldn't grant us that. They decided that was a no. However, under general permitted development for an agricultural building, they couldn't refuse us for it. So we had to do a planning application for the change of use on the land, general permitted development application for the erection of the barn, and then a change of use application for the barn to be able to use it for the glamping business, which felt a really long journey to get to the same destination that we could have done in one application. But the actual process itself, I suppose, overall took about 9 months. It just took a long time. They didn't need to be quite as obtuse as they were, but it just took a long time. Now, I suspect we did tentatively look in the last 2 years at doing another bit, but pulled out from doing that. They were wanting geological surveys, topography surveys, bat surveys, environmental impact assessments, percolation tests on soil as well, ground conditions, and there was slightly increase in terms of environment for our waste collection. So it's got tighter in terms of the extra additions that we'd need to put in for the planning, to my understanding, to where we were back in 2009 when we first looked at it.
And that's in what was an AONB, now protected landscape, as a sort of change of name. But even so, a rural area, you would think that the planning authority would be more amenable to encouraging rural enterprises and boosting the rural economy.
I mean, without wanting to stray into danger of politics, but sometimes national headlines about stimulating the rural economy and growing businesses doesn't always translate to the same as what county or district planning authorities seem to actually work to.
Thank you. And Johnny, a different area south of Northampton, has it been difficult or easy for you to obtain planning permission? I know it's a slightly different question to obtaining planning permission to convert arable farmland into a campsite, but it would be interesting to know your experience of obtaining planning permission for the various enterprises that you've had.
It's been very hard. Next question. I don't know how to answer the question constructively, because everyone likes to moan that their local authority is the worst. I recently actually was shown the national league table for dealing with planning consultations on time, and sure enough, ours was right down the bottom 10%. It's a league table I recommend your listeners to have a look at if they want to. It's been really challenging for us. And when people ask me, what is my biggest business challenge? It's definitely planning permission. We find, well, they're 50% staffed at the moment. They're using contractors for everything, and they don't pay the contractors, so the contractors don't do the work. I think, given we have a general election on board, this is a major issue for me.
And the challenges around planning, I think, amply illustrated by Clarkson's Farm, which I think everybody's probably watching this as at least if they've not seen that, at least have heard about it and brought it really, really to life. There's a question here from Johnny Bruce. I've not read it completely, but I'm going to read it out. Given that the majority of diversification projects typically involve lengthy or costly planning applications and resultant change of use for land parcels out of agricultural production with an impact on tax, etc., are there examples of try before you buy, or where projects have failed and land has been returned to agricultural use? Hamish, would you be able to answer that question? Do you sort of understand what Johnny Bruce is getting?
The tax is obviously an element, and and it's where it was straight out of my expertise into that of an accountant, but broadly, you risk losing agricultural property relief when there's a change of use. Now, certain operations, if it's sort of closely related to trading, can attract business property relief. However, if it's deemed to be more on the investment side of things, you wouldn't have that. So, in terms of thinking about succession planning, it's certainly the taxation element is something that needs to be carefully considered. But in terms of it being then where they've failed and then returning it to agricultural use, I have to say, hand on heart, that's I haven't dealt with one of those yet, so I can't answer that part of the question.
Thank you. Thanks, Hamish. Greg, how about you?
I have seen one or two situations where people have returned things from commercial use to agricultural use, not necessarily because things failed, but circumstances changed, and actually there are needs on the farming side, and the farming business was developed with investment in other enterprises, poultry particularly, and that meant a need for change as well. So I don't think some of these diversifications are not forever. You do them for a period of time, and markets change, the market outlet for what they were doing changed, so they reverted back to farming. So perfectly possible from a practical perspective.
Thank you very much. Another question, Barker says here, in relation to on-farm diversification projects, have the panel any thoughts about business structures, limited companies, partnership, etc., with regard to inheritance tax, APR, BPR reliefs, etc., James and Johnny, let's start with James. Did you set up a new company? Was it how did it work for you, James? What sort of business structure did you decide to use?
So a bit like Johnny shooting in the sky and see what fell down, really. As we started as we are a partnership. Part of that course that I went on, which I mentioned earlier from the Bushville company, I came back from that and then started to look seriously at succession planning. So we were a family partnership. It was seemed an all right document to me, but that's where I quickly learned that if you don't have a bespoke type agreement now, then you revert back to something like the 1840 Partnerships Act. It's a bit of Victorian legislation when a partner dies. So we upgraded our partnership document, brought it into the 21st century. The glamping, when we started it, my wife and I ran it together as a separate partnership on the business, which we rented the area from the farm. But since my parents passed away, so we've gone through two sets of transference with the inheritance tax, so APR, BPR as well gone through. We've gone through that well because of the succession planning we put in place. We understood that what we had on the farm should attract the reliefs. We'd already looked at that proactively rather than reacting to the situation. my wife's now become a partner, a full partner in the entire business. Everything's been subsumed into one partnership. And that model for us seems to work all right for what we're doing. But if we are looking at another project on the farm, which is much longer term and would be a very, very, very large investment if we did it, again, we would, part of that package is we'd have to take some legal advice over whether we'd start a different business structure for that, isolate it out from the partnership, or how to look at it. It's just because it is so different to what we do and such a large investment. Yeah, we'd have to look at it. But I think that's part of what you need to do, is to actually give a little bit of consideration about the future. And that sticks with actually what you've got now. It was amazing when we started looking at our succession plan and how things that what people thought they weren't actually in reality. So land ownership, who owned what? The tracts of land, getting the land registered on the Royal Land Registry, getting all to use the saying, get all your ducks in a row. So we did all that years in advance, and so when the problems cropped up, actually it wasn't a problem, it was just a process.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Johnny, Hamish and Greg in a moment for their views on sort of company structures or business structures when diversifying, but just sticking with you, James, because there's another question here. It's very specific to you. You may or may not choose to answer it. Stanislava Kostelanska, she says, regarding the external company that was you partnered with to start glamping, did you feel there were any, I guess there were going to be upsides and downsides to working with somebody else? Were there areas that you struggled with regarding the relationship, and are you still involved with them? And so I guess you may or may not want to answer that question, but there are going to be advantages and disadvantages, aren't there, partnering with somebody else?
It's okay. So yes and yes. So it's an external company. It's a European-based company. I mean, it was a fascinating experience coming from a farming background. We tend to be quite, we operate in a different way in the farming world. If you say you're going to do something, you shake hands on it and you're going to do it, and you stand by your word. No, we found the other company to be a little bit more brutal sometimes in their business outlook. And you definitely had to nail down contracts, get everything written. If it wasn't in writing, it probably wasn't going to happen. And until it's a problem. We've gone through several different ownerships with them, but we're now at a place, we have changed the structure with them. We do still work with them, but nowhere near in the same way that we were originally. We use their name. They're a booking agent for us. They have brilliant brand recognition. That's very strong. I mean, it's an interesting, and it's fascinating. When you work with another business outside of farming, we become quite compartmentalized, quite siloed in what we do. Well, this is how work is. And then you work with another company and, well, blimey, there's different ways of doing this. So, for example, comes to marketing, something like 20% of turnover gets spent on marketing for what we do. Now, in farming, you don't even think about really marketing. I mean, you might quibble a bit about the HDB levy or something, but actually, that's less than 1%. I spend 20% of turnover on marketing because you've got to be known. You've got to get your name out there. If people don't know who you are, they're not going to come to you. And so understanding that and not being afraid to put that investment in was something but we use that brand to help us with that. So yes, absolutely, there are challenges. You definitely got to go in with your eyes open, and you've got to fight your corner a bit as well. It's just a different way of business, and we had to learn that quite quick with a tin hat. But we're in a good place now with it, I'd say.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that, Johnny. Business structures. How did you sort of choose the business structure for your enterprises?
I didn't, Johan. So so as you know, we've been around for a while. So I effectively inherited the structure that is a partnership. We're a partnership like James. And one of the drums that I always like to bang is I feel like partnerships are kind of the forgotten entity when it comes to government policy. And I think that's a real challenge. If you gave me the ability to start from scratch, I would go for a limited company. I'd incorporate, but the changeover to an incorporated company from a partnership is really quite challenging. And it's lucky that we don't have an accountant on this at the moment. I'm desperate to keep things simple. I don't mind paying a little bit more tax if I can make things significantly more simple. And I always try and get that message across to our accountants who love to just make things a little bit more complicated if we can save some tax here and there. But we have the challenge that comes with making sure that we qualify for APR on Balfour at the risk of getting technical. So we make sure that if something is big and it's non-trading, that we try and take it outside the partnership. We're just in planning at the moment for a big farm shop and cafe as part of a joint venture, and we are going to put that into a limited company, not because it's non-trading, but because we want to firewall the risk. So it's not always a tax consideration, is it? It's actually just making sure that you've isolated that risk as well, that financial risk.
Thank you. Hamish, business structures?
I think so. I think it definitely needs some consideration. The point of sort of ring fencing the core business, I think, is an important one. And going into a limited company is for a new venture, and sort of keeping that completely discrete to the farming business has its merits, but it's going to boil down to it's going to come down to a farm level. I think. I don't think there's a one size fits all approach to every diversification on every farm.
Thank you, Greg. Individual circumstances are obviously.
Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say individual circumstances are going to differ. How do you decide on a business structure?
Yeah, I think. My experience. We're not accountants. I think some good accountancy inputs required for a lot of business diversifications. I think we tend to see, from a practical point of view, lots of people start on a diversification in a small way, and they generally often don't change the business structure. But as things grow, or as Johnny said, with something pretty major, the majority of our clients have got a separate limited company, not just for the financial implications and saving some tax, but and those kind of things, but also from the limited liability perspective, and just to ring fence and protect that the rest of the business from the new ventures. So I think it's quite an important area to get right, and probably setting it up at the outset is quite key. So a good discussion with accountant at the time is pretty important.
Thank you very much. There's a number of questions here. Very small sort of enterprises. Donna Udall says that I work full-time and I only have 20 acres and a couple of farm buildings. I'm thinking of offering accommodation and offering one of my fields, which already has a loo block in it, as a demonstration or event site. It's really, really difficult to get advice because I'm too small to interest my land agent. Where could I get advice? Where should I go for advice? Is there a place that people can go for advice? I mean, I could say read Farmers Weekly. There's plenty of advice in there. Look on the Farmers Weekly website. But more seriously, Hamish and Greg, we'll start with you, Hamish. Where should people go to advice? Is there sort of somewhere for small people? Will you take anybody on?
I think to a certain extent, we deal with sort of all sorts of sizes of business. I think depending on what the advice, what advice is required. But when you're talking about planning advice, there's always there's obviously the route of taking to a consultant, but there's also, you can have a pre-app discussion with the local authority and actually make some inquiries directly with them. So there are certainly avenues open, and I think in terms of the land agent, I expect there would be there will be many more out there that can help.
Thank you, Greg.
Yes, it's probably worth. For somebody who's got a small farm in the right locality. In England, I'm not sure where this is, but there is advice provide some free advice provided by Future Farm Resilience Fund, and there are 17 providers across the country, and they would provide some input into helping get something like that, just some initial work done to see perhaps and think about whether it's a goer or a starter for 10, those kind of things. We have a service called the Farm Business Advice Service in the north of England, but there are providers all over England available to make, to help with those kind of things. So there is some free advice, and then probably, as Hamish said, I think do a lot of research yourself, and then perhaps there comes a point where you have to pay for some professional input if you want some advice, but do as much research to begin with yourselves.
Thank you. James, was there any way that you went initially? I know 2010 was a fair while ago, before the Future Farming Resilience Fund was set up by DEFRA, but where did you go for advice initially?
So originally we just started to try and look at researching different ideas. And so, we went to Google and started to try to find other things, other businesses, other farms that were doing what we were thinking of doing. I mean, we were talking about 6 to 8 months or so of different research. We went and visited different places, talked to different people. And generally, people are pretty helpful and talkative. They'll they might not give you full business plans and details, but they give you an idea, a flavour of what to expect. And as we looked at the company that we went in with, they actually then put us in touch with other farms that they work with. So we went and visited them and had a look at what they were doing and got it from the farmer's point of view, which was really useful. Just recently, we have used the farm resilience funding. We've had some of that done to look at our general business. So I do know that is there, and that could be targeted and used to try and help a bit more. But I still think actually doing background research around what you're thinking of doing to see who else is doing it, what they're doing it, and to get some ideas. It really doesn't hurt to spend a bit of time doing that, because if you're going to start before you start spending money, because once you commit to spending money, then you're on that path. Ideally, you want to know the route of your path before you start spending.
Thank you. And Johnny, where did you go? I mean, about cooperation, we're not great at that as an industry. It's getting better, but certainly if you look to the continent, farmers in other countries seem to be a lot more cooperative in many cases than we are in the UK. But where did you go to advice?
One of the earliest bits of advice was given to me was read the comics. So I subscribed to Farmers Weekly and all the other relevant journals, and sort of got some basic information and networking from that. But I really go back to my point earlier about networking. Go to the conferences, sign up for the newsletters, get to know people, and just ask them. And we might not be amazing at collaborating from a business point of view, industry, but we are very friendly. And like James said, people might not give you their business plans, but they'll help you. And I've certainly found that myself. Another useful source of free business advice I found is the local enterprise partnership. It's well worth seeking out your LEP for your area. And one way of saving on money a bit is to join an organization like the CLA on the basis that once you're a member, they will actually give you advice as part of your membership. So I think that's well worth considering too, and they've been very good for us.
Thank you. Any other comments on where to go for advice from anybody? I'll go to another question. Ros Lord's question that's just come in. Has anybody used a SSAS, a small self-administered scheme on their farm? Are you finding that more people, this is to do with pensions, I believe, Greg, isn't it? Is more people using this sort of structure to embark on diversifications?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure what the initials stand for, actually. And I don't generally, I mean, when we're looking at any sort of diversification with clients, they've tended to be financing them through traditional loans, other sources of finance, whatever that might be, depending on the level of finance and what it's for. So quite a lot of HP agreements. I'm not sure I can comment on the SAS structure myself.
Okay, and Hamish, yourself, can you comment on that?
I'm going to sidestep that one as well, if that's all right, Jonathan.
No, that's fine.
Probably should have Googled it, shouldn't we?
Well, that's fine. Well, that's exactly what I did, so there's no shame in that. As I took a leaf out of James's book. Google was my friend on that one as well. Let's go on. So I apologise to Ross that we can't exactly answer that question for her. Let's have a look here. Biodiversity net gain. I mean, there is a question here from Fran Harris, who says, "Is biodiversity net gain becoming a viable option as a diversification?" Again, I guess this is Hamish and Greg primarily. Are you seeing more interest in BNG as a diversification, a viable diversification on farms?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's what I would say about BNG is I don't sort of, we haven't seen the uptake. You know, it's sort of, we haven't seen as much uptake as the sort of, you know, as we perhaps thought we would do. It's been a sort of slower burner to get going. I'm sort of conscious. I'm actually looking for a site for a house builder to provide some BNG so within a certain catchment, and you know, if it fits, it's a long commitment. But I think if it fits, and that's what the owners and, you know, and sort of also bearing in mind, because they're long agreements, perhaps the next generation want to do with the land, then you know it can work. But it's not, you know, as I said, we're not seeing the you know, it was sort of billed to be sort of bigger than it's turned out to be from my personal experience. But there's no reason why not to consider, you know, not to consider BNG if you've got the right site for it.
Thank you. Greg, are you seeing many inquiries?
It's a little bit outside of my area of expertise, but a few of my colleagues are definitely seeing inquiries and are looking at some opportunities at the moment. I think probably understand the numbers, understand the implications, what you're signing up to, commitments for a long period of time, and what do you do with the land once those commitments finish. Key questions to be asked.
Thank you. Thanks. James and Johnny, biodiversity net gain, are either of you involved or tempted to become involved in that? Johnny?
So I chair the Environmental Farmers Group region for Central England. Environmental Farmers Group, some of your listeners may know, is a big cooperative of farmers coming together to achieve good things in natural capital and to trade on natural capital. And obviously, BNG is one of those types of natural capital that can be traded. And I agree with what Hamish was saying, that there was a lot of talk about the size of this market, and I think that's yet to be proven. But my impression is that if you're in the right location, there is likely to be a good market, but your location is going to be key. There needs to be development nearby, and you have to be in the same local authority. I think there is some very attractive opportunities if you can make it work, but you need to be prepared for taking it very seriously. It's a big job. It's not to be gone into lightly. We are looking at it very seriously here, but I only want to do it as part of EFG because I feel that way I have the hand holding of a big organization behind me rather than doing it as a lone farmer. I think in contacts with local authority and with local developers are absolutely key. And so if you can find someone to help you do that, whether it's an agent or whether it's someone like EFG, that's got to be the way forward.
And like you say, it's one thing creating the biodiversity net gain. It's another thing managing it for that 30-year period or whatever the length of the agreement might be. So that is a long commitment. Yeah. James, yourself, are you something that you've looked at or steered clear from?
So when it was first mooted, I suspect, like most people, I got quite excited about the figures that were being bandied around potentially. We have put an expression of interest for it in principle. But as ever, as the detail starts coming out, that's where we're finding the devil lives. And so I would have concerns around it. Principally, the way that we farm at the moment, we wouldn't have as much offset gain because of the way the policy is created. So it feels like it would better suit land that would be more perhaps intensive arable, that would be changing over to a greater biodiverse gain as opposed to the way that we particularly farm, although we would be in a good area for it. I have concerns over the length of time of the agreement. I mean, I don't know exactly what I'm doing in 10 years' time, much less 30 years' time. And some of the agreements are for longer than that. I have concerns over who holds on to the money and the sustainability of that. I have concerns. I have lots of concerns. I have lots of concerns, which probably runs into questions really over it. in principle, it seemed a reasonably good idea. I'm just not so sure. Also, we touched on tax earlier. There's a tax implication potentially around it. Is it investment? Is it trading? I'm not sure if HMRC has come back with clarification on that at the moment. How does it fit in with inheritance tax, with APR, with BPR? So I think it's going to come down to what you as a business are, what likely succession's looking at, what your structure is, what land type you've got, where your location is, what your mindset is towards it. And it feels like every agreement has to be a bespoke agreement, which you need to take significant advice on before entering into. But with all that done, and you feel that it works for you, and if it's what you want to do, then it's absolutely something you should look at progressing.
Thank you. You mentioned mindset there, James, and both yourself and Johnny are involved in diversifications which are very public facing and involve interaction with the public. It's not something that's for everybody, and I think it's worth probably talking a little bit about that. It does require a change in mindset, or maybe not a change in mindset, but you need to be a welcoming kind of person if you're going to welcome somebody on your onto your farm or onto your land for, be it weddings, events, or glamping a holiday. Has that been, James, to start with you, has that been easy for you to do? Are you a gregarious person, welcoming welcoming people onto your land, or has it been something you've had to get used to?
It's definitely something that has been enhanced. So I was probably more that way inclined than I originally realised. You are right, though. I mean, you're inviting people to come onto your property, so you kind of got to be open and honest about it. They're coming to stay with us. They're wanting to stay on a farm. They want to understand about what we do, about the farm and the way that we produce food, what's happening. And so we've got to put ourselves out to allow for that. So we offer farm tours. We'll do a tractor trailer ride around. I'll explain everything that we do on the farm and why we do it, because they're already engaged to want to come and learn. So I think that's quite important, that actually we take the time. We have a lot of things about how people should back British farming. Well, actually, then we as British farmers need to turn around and actually give the public some engagement, some support, some understanding of what we do. So that means investing time into it. So yeah, I might be pushed for time, but actually I've got to take the time to spend with those people, to have a chat with them. We also do weddings. We got 3 weddings here this year, and those couples generally, fortunately, they're not so much on the farming side of it. They're tending to want to have the location. They want the view. But you've still got to put the time in for that. If you are time poor, don't go into this as a diversification. This was a side diversification, which when we're busy takes 4 days of my week that we'll spend on the glamping side of things. It's very different to farming.
Johnny, thank you. Johnny, how about yourself? Interacting with the public, something that is come easily to you?
Yeah, I think my previous career probably helped with that, but I think it's very circumstantial. Dealing with piss people at weddings, I could probably do less of that. But for Open Farm Sunday, we have a lot of schools here on different schemes. I absolutely love that. It's great. And I totally agree with what James is saying. The onus is on us. If we want to make things better, we've got to start giving back and interacting with that. And I think even people who wouldn't expect to enjoy it will probably be surprised when they actually do it.
Thank you. Thanks. Hamish, I'll ask you, and then Greg, same question really. I mean, you do have to have this sort of change of mindset, do things a little bit differently, and perhaps be welcoming to and open to the idea of having people visit your farm if you're going to do a public facing farm diversification.
Yeah, I mean, I know it doesn't suit everyone, but I think, mirroring what James and Johnny said, the engagement with the public, there are sort of fundamental customers and bread and butter really, and it's and the sort of many of the misconceptions about what we do sort of are based around you watch you watch something that's sort of maybe pointing a finger at farming, and you'll see images of feedlots in the US and what have you, and actually just sort of explaining how we do it, and and the standards, the sort of gold-plated standards that we work to is, I think it's, it's an important, it's often done, for nothing by farms, open farm funding and what have you, but it's tremendously important for the industry to move forward, isn't it?
Thank you. Greg?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely one or two people who probably diversification is not for them because of their innate character. But I think, again, lots of farmers, they really enjoy it when they get into it. And actually they get a bit of a buzz, gives them a bit more of, a bit of diversity to the business. I mean, they're in the name, I suppose. But and perhaps opens their eyes to different things, how they run the business, both from the farming perspective and from the new opportunities. So I think a lot to be gained from that, and it definitely needs the right mindset, a positive attitude, probably some quite difficult challenges that have got to be addressed, whether it's on an annual basis with different cycles, or whether it's to do with just managing the people, getting the marketing right, making sure the customers are still coming through the door. All of those things can bring challenge, but they also are quite rewarding when they go right as well.
Thank you very much. We're nearly out of time. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go round, and it's always a little bit unfair, but for the person who has to go first, but also the person who has to go last, and perhaps think of something different to what everybody else has already said. But if I start with you, James, what would your take-home message be? People thinking about diversification and watching this, listening to this, if they were thinking about diversification, what would you what would you tell them?
I suppose the first thing is, what is it that you're currently doing? If you're running a business and that business is profitable, ticking over and providing an income for you, then what's your reason to want to go into diversification, to do something else? Whatever it may be, justify that to yourself why you want to do it. If your current core business is not profitable, you're not getting on with it very well, you're struggling with it, then I think it's probably question first, why look at that before you go into it. Because if you're thinking that you're going to go into a diversification to help prop up your core business, why? That would be my first bit. Why do that? It has to be, you have to be going into the diversification because it's enhancing what you're doing. It has a good synergy with what you're doing. Maybe it's more reflective of what you want to do as a personality. We're talking about people and engagement. Maybe that's the way that it just works better for you. But if you're going to try and do something business to keep a business that isn't working very well going, I think that's the wrong reason to go into it. You have to go into the diversification if you're going to do it because you want to do that, because it has its own purpose. It's going to provide something that you want very clearly from it. So I think my first bit from it is that just, why do you want to do it? What's the purpose? Why? What's it going to enhance? What's it going to do for you? How is it going to benefit?
Thank you. Johnny, how about yourself?
Yeah, so James has talked about that Venn diagram we touched on earlier about passion and profit, and ideally you get both, but it can be one or the other. I think you just need to be honest with yourself, why you're doing it and how you're going to do about it. And in order to achieve that honesty, you've got to get help from other people, as we've talked about earlier, and we've talked about methods to do that. I think you've got to make sure you surround yourself with people who are going to challenge you, who are actually going to say, well, yeah, you might really love this idea, but let's really pick it apart. And whether they're paid advisors or unpaid advisors, surround yourself with people who are going to challenge you in a healthy and constructive manner.
Thank you very much. Greg, I'm going to go to you next.
All right. Again, I agree with both Johnny and James. I think if you've got a successful business and you've got an idea and an opportunity and you do your homework thoroughly, make sure you've thought it through, go for it, as long as you think it stacks up, but make sure that homework is done and the research is done and the preparation and the planning is carried out appropriately beforehand.
Thank you. And finally, yourself, Hamish.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm going to mirror what's been said about, you can't, it shouldn't, the wrong reason is to prop up a core business that doesn't work, and to prop up a core farming business that doesn't work will sort of take a hell of a diversification very often. But it's a new business. A diversification is a new business. It just happens to be taking place on a farm, and if the opportunity is right, the same rules apply to any business, don't they? So for me as a father with two young kids, the amount of stuff we do throughout the year that is sort of farm diversification, we go and do things. Life wouldn't be, it wouldn't be colourful. It would be a lot more boring if we didn't have those things locally that farmers were doing, to be honest.
Thank you very much. Look, thank you all of you. Thanks to everybody who's been watching and sent in questions. We got through most of them. That is about it for this episode, or this transition webinar. We hope that you found it useful. It will be available online to watch all over again if you so choose. And it just leaves it for me to say thank you to our 4 panelists: Hamish Wardrop, National Rural Consultancy Manager for Agravista; Greg Ricketts, Head of Farm Business for GSC Grays; Johnny Wake, Managing Partner of Courtenay Farms; and James Small, 3rd generation livestock farmer, farming on the Mendip Hills in Somerset. Thank you all very much for joining us, giving up your time this evening for this Farmers Weekly Transition webinar. I'm your host, Johan Tasker. Thank you all again for tuning in and listening, and we will see you again sometime soon. In the meantime, you can visit the Farmers Weekly Transition Hub, which is at fwi.co.uk/transition. Lots of information there on the website about how you can diversify, or indeed specialise and add value to one of your existing farming enterprises. But for now, thank you and goodbye.